I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Mullin. He was a Labour MP for 23 years, served under 4 Labour leaders. He's got a brilliant new book out. Let's have a look at it now. Didn't you used to be Chris Mullin is the title, which I think reflects the fact that that's probably what most people say to you when they stop you in the street, Chris. He's also the author of a book you'll probably recognise the title of, A Very British Coup. So since leaving the party and indeed being an MP in Sunderland South from 1987 to 2010, Chris, you've spent your life on the road writing and, as we've just discussed, being at literary festivals and all the rest of it. Was it difficult leaving office, or was it actually a bit of a relief in the end?
Well, for those who've read the previous volume of diaries will know that a great deal of agonising went into the decision whether to stand down in 2010. It was either the best decision or the worst I'd ever made, and it's turned out extremely well, I'm pleased to report. If I'd stayed, I'd have spent another decade yah-booing on the back benches to absolutely no effect whatever. So I've had a very good time since I retired, and I don't regret it at all.
Well, as you're a sage of all things Labour, let's ask you what you make of Keir Starmer's leadership, because serving under 4 leaders has given you some good experience of different characters. I wrote a column, you said earlier that you did read The Telegraph occasionally. I wrote a column saying nobody wants Keir Starmer to be Prime Minister. And what I meant by that is we don't have people lining the streets saying, yeah, come on Starmer, like we did Blair. Do you think that's a problem for him?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think after Boris Johnson, we could do with somebody a bit less flamboyant.
Yeah.
His problem is going to be that well, and you can see why he's very cautious. He's got to take a swathe of the middle class. It's not every last Daily Telegraph reader with him, but he's got to capture some of them to form a government. That's the reality of politics in this country.
Can we see that happening? I mean, they might be really annoyed with the Tories, but they're not necessarily flocking towards the Labour Party.
I certainly accept that, yes, and that's the challenge he faces. I do understand why they're so cautious. They're a bit too cautious for my view. Take a controversial issue like tax, which of course he's only done the same thing as Blair did and said he won't put up tax in his first year in office, term in office.
Yeah.
But I understand why, because mass hysteria gets organised by papers like The Telegraph and The Sun and the Daily Mail.
What you're suggesting, Chris. but he might win over more Telegraph readers if, for instance, he did ape Blair and said he was perfectly comfortable about the filthy rich and all the rest of it. I mean, the trouble is with Labour is, I suppose, the criticism of Starmer is all things to all men, but not really attracting any of them. You've got this Brexit conundrum. I mean, are you worried that Brexit has had a hugely negative impact on Labour's sort of original red wall working class following?
Yeah, well, I think it's a temporary impact. It certainly did. There's no question about that. But I don't think it'll be the issue at the next election. People have now had a few years to see where it's all leading. And the big issue is going to be the steady decline of public services. That does pose a dilemma for Labour, because they've got to say how they're going to fund an alternative or expand the alternative. But I was reading that Bible of free marketeers, The Economist, the other day, and on July the 8th they had an editorial that began, Britain has been poorly governed for the last 13 years, and they then went on to enumerate how, they listed all the main indices, what they said, homelessness, hospital waiting lists, pay, all these things have been in steep decline. I think they'll have a much bigger impact than Brexit.
But at the same time, you could have some on the right saying, well, unfortunately, we entered into this big spending era under Blair, and we've never been able to rein it in. Greg Hands, the Tory party chairman, makes a lot. In fact, he's kind of overdoing the joke of that letter that Liam Byrne left.
5 letters, 5 elections now, and they're
still
at it.
I know. But the Liam Byrne, you know, there's no money left in the Treasury argument is an argument against bringing the Labour Party back in if they're going to be extremely profligate with taxpayers' money.
And do you think they will?
Well, I think that we're choosing between 2 extremely profligate choices, aren't we? You know, we have a Prime Minister who brought in furlough, and we're now sort of paying the economic price. And we've got a Labour Prime Minister, a wannabe Labour Prime Minister, who keeps on coming up with all of these pledges to spend $28 billion a year, for instance, on green issues, and doesn't seem to be able to say where the money's coming from, beyond a windfall tax that seems to have been spent now, I think, about 20 different ways.
Well, the Tories adopted that suggestion, didn't they? Labour started with Ed Miliband, and the Tories adopted it, I think. There's been one. But I do think in this country, looking at the bigger picture, we need a debate about taxation.
Yeah.
I know it's an article of faith in certain quarters that taxes are the highest they've ever been and that we're all taxed into the ground. And the word burden is always used in taxation. You could actually defend taxation by saying it's a subscription we pay for living in civilization.
Well, you can defend it if people think the public services in return are good enough.
Well, they've been in decline. You can have a debate about why that is, partly, not entirely. It's to do with spending. But we actually, our rate of... I had a letter the other day from a city economist, so not a natural Labour voter, who said that taxation in this country, what's it, 37-38%, is less than in most comparable North European states.
Yeah, although
and it
the
obviously
income tax rate is significantly under that of, say, the US.
Well, yes, but I do not wish to go down the US road with the US levels of inequality, though we are heading in that direction.
So you want higher taxes?
Well, if you want more public spending.
Right.
That's the dilemma that the electorate have to decide.
Yeah.
And the dilemma that the politicians have is whether they're brave enough to raise the subject. We could have then an argument about it, but at the moment everybody's trying not to even discuss it. I do understand why, because of the absolute terror of the right-wing press on the Labour side.
But having said that, I suppose you could argue for higher taxes and higher spending being more left of the spectrum. And then the last person that tried to be more left of the spectrum under Labour, it was disastrous for him, Jeremy Corbyn. That kind of socialist economic approach didn't seem to go down particularly well with the masses, and of course he suffered that spectacular defeat in 2019.
Yeah, not in 2017 though, did he?
Well, do you
got
think...
more votes than Blair in 2005.
Well, I know, but at the same time, you could argue, because of the shambles that was that snap election and Theresa May losing a majority, that a different leader who was more acceptable than Jeremy Corbyn, and let's face it, quite a few leaders would have done better, even better than that.
Yes, I'm not a Corbynista.
I know.
I like him. He's a lovely fellow, a thoroughly decent human being.
Is he a lovely fellow?
Yes, he is. I've known him for 40 years.
I might not think that if you were in the Jewish
deprecated.
community, perhaps.
Well, he was framed, frankly. Framed. I repeat the word. Yes, he was.
He shared the mural, Chris. Come on now. I mean, I wasn't... My stepmother's Jewish. She wasn't comfortable with that mural. What on earth was he thinking sharing it?
I've known him for 40 years. He's a thoroughly decent human being.
But not a great leader of the Labour Party.
No, hopeless. And the great problem for Corbyn was, of course, that in a parliamentary democracy, or the great problem for Labour, I should say, that in a parliamentary democracy, you can't have a leader who's only got the support of 10% of his MPs. No. You can't do it. That's why I'm not...
But do you think he's been unfairly treated by the party, him and Diane Abbott?
Yes,
We've had this strange situation with Neil Lawson being thrown out of the party because he's tweeted something about electoral pacts.
Well, politics these days, I wouldn't qualify as a Labour candidate now, because somebody would go back through my tweets and they'd find 2 years ago that I'd liked something that I shouldn't have liked.
Well, you barely qualified at the time, because leader Neil Kinnock at the time asked, what's gone wrong in Sunderland? They've gone and selected a certifiable lunatic.
Yes, but the point about... yes, he's...
Sorry to bring that up again,
no,
Chris.
You're quite right, too. But the point about Kinnock is he didn't interfere in the process.
So do you think Keir Starmer is too interfering?
To lift his little finger.
I mean, is he too interfering, and is he actually cutting his nose off to spite his face because he's alienating the left?
It's not so much the left. I mean, Labour Party's always been a bit of a coalition.
It's an understatement.
Well, it has. I think the Tory Party is obviously a coalition between some quite wide views.
Yes.
And that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing in a democracy for both parties, I think.
Do you agree with Blunkett saying in the Telegraph today that Labour needs a miracle to win in 2024? I mean, he's saying it's not 92 or 97, it's 64.
Well, I don't think it needs a miracle. I don't think it's entirely helpful for David Blunkett, who is one of the big beasts of a previous era, to be opining every week in the Sunday Telegraph. But
it's a great place to opine. Feel free to opine
I write
yourself.
for Tory newspapers myself. I can't really complain.
But you think they can win?
Yes, of course they can. Yes, I think all the polls suggest that.
Comprehensively, a majority?
It's not a done deal. It's not a done deal, but I don't think the Tories are going to be a majority in the next election.
All right.
No, I really don't.
Which might make a third volume for
the Liberals
you, actually,
will win.
Chris.
No, that's the fourth volume.
There's a fourth volume, sorry, because I thought after the very British coup, I'm behind the curve. So this is number 4, but I'm saying if we have excitement come next autumn, you might have a number 5 coming out.
No, I don't think so. I think I've stretched the elastic about
You're
as far
booked
as
out.
it will go.
All right. Well, look, let's give this a plug. Didn't you used to be Chris Mullin? It's Chris Mullin's diaries from 2000 and... 10, isn't it? You start from when
2010
you
to
left,
2022.
10 when you stood down, and then 22
up
last
to the death
year.
of the Queen. It ends with the death of the Queen.